The backup quarterback is the most popular guy in town. That's especially true after a sleepwalk victory over an FCS opponent. We will get into the Joe Milton versus Nico conversation today on the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside Adam Sparks and John Adams. Guys, I was down in Birmingham last week covering Alabama, Texas, and following Tennessee kind of from afar. I read your coverage afterwards. And reading the coverage of that game, you wouldn't have known Tennessee won by 3 scores. I think that just sort of summed up, I guess, the play that was. And sometimes when you play those FCS opponents, a little more is expected than just winning by a few scores. Paint a picture for me. Why did things go awry on Saturday, and why was that offense stuck in neutral for a while?
I mean, there's a few ways you can get to playing down to your competition of an FCS team actually hanging with you for the majority of a game. One of them is you can just sleepwalk through the thing and you're not motivated, you're not paying attention, and the other team is motivated. There was a little bit of that, but you can get over that. You can say, hey, should have woke up, should have taken this team seriously, but that's fixed the next week because you're playing Florida, you're playing an SEC game, and no harm, no foul. The second way you can do it is if you're just really struggling in an area, and that area could be even worse in conference games. And I think the latter is that type of situation, I think, is what the Vol fans that I talk to that are concerned, I think that's why they're concerned. Because in some ways, Tennessee was not 100% into the game, especially early in the game. But in other ways, Austin Peay stifled their passing game, and that's a really, really big problem. Now, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it, but Austin Peay did what other football teams can do. I don't care what level they are. They dropped 8 guys. They came up to the line. They looked like they were going to blitz, and then they would drop 8 guys. And so Tennessee wanted to go deep. They couldn't go deep, and Tennessee had to adjust to Austin Peay. That sometimes can happen even against an FCS team. But that if you're having trouble in that game, you could certainly have more trouble against Florida in conference games. And that's why people are concerned, because maybe this was a football problem and not necessarily a mindset problem.
I got 2 types of emails after writing about that game. One were from fans who, as Adam said, were concerned about the passing, who just thought it was a dreadful performance overall, and others who would say, well, we won the game. What do you want?
Yeah, you were too negative, John. That's what I heard.
I said, somebody told me it was time for me to leave.
That's the first time you've heard that, isn't it?
It's yeah. I've been here for over 30 years, but hadn't left yet. But I look at that game, and I think the way Adam pointed it out was the passing game. We've come to expect certain things from a Josh Heupel team, and we expect big passing plays. We just do, and particularly against an inferior opponent. It's just you expect a blowout, and that's not based on wishful thinking. It's based on track record. I mean, Tennessee is averaging over 40 points per game. It was averaging that in its first 27 games under Heupel. Yet it scored 30 against Austin Peay. Whatever the reason, that is very much a cause for concern.
Yeah, and I want to hit on something that maybe the third kind of email that I got, in addition to the 2 kinds that John got, was that, hey, guys, Josh Heupel held things back. It was very vanilla, didn't want to show anything. That's true later in the game. That is not true early in the game. I mean, and also I think there's a misconception of Tennessee's offense. Tennessee's offense is not a lot of crazy type play calls. It's tempo and it's style. It's, you're spreading people out. If the defense at the beginning of the game is more centered to the field, then you're going to start throwing side to side. That's going to spread them out. Then you're going to be able to run, and then you're going to throw vertical routes in the middle of the field because then they're spread out. If at the beginning of the game you spread your receivers out, the wide splits as they do, and you're already spread out. If the defense is already spread out, then you can go ahead and hit the middle early. And Austin Peay was more of the latter. They dropped guys deep into coverage, but they also were out on the outside, so they gave up the middle. Tennessee threw to the middle, and Joe Milton misfired. And then Austin Peay adjusted and to what was open. Other things came open, and then Tennessee dropped open passes. It wasn't like Tennessee was not vanilla at the beginning. They played the game exactly how you would think they would play. They looked at what the defense was giving them. They took it. They did not execute. And again, that's the issue, is that Tennessee tried to play their game and it didn't work. It got more vanilla later in the game because Tennessee looked at it and said, okay, we're just going to have to do pitch and catch, run the ball, and just win the game. I think that was more concerning, that Tennessee did not do what it wanted to do. It did what it had to do to beat Austin Peay. Tennessee should be able to do what it wanted to do. And if you think back the last 2 years, especially last season, Tennessee usually against pretty much any opponent offensively decided what it wanted to do, and it did it. And that did not happen in this game. And they're going to have to be able to dictate the offense more against Florida.
So with that in mind, guys, I mean, how serious should the concern be about Joe Milton, and how serious should we take, the calls that you hear from the fans sometimes about the backup quarterback? I mean, look, we know this happens. We knew it would happen. At the first sign of trouble, the first incompletion, you'd hear whispers of Nico, and by the third incompletion, you'd hear it in conversational tones, and as they continue to pile up, you might finally start hearing chants of it, right? I mean, that's life as a starting quarterback in this conference at Tennessee. At the first sign of struggle, especially when there's a 5-star freshman waiting in the wings, there's going to be scrutiny. And this was not the good Joe Milton on Saturday against Austin Peay. Really struggled to hit in the first half. I know some drop passes factored in, and then as you said, Adam, maybe they did kind of hold back by necessity throughout the second half and went into like quick stuff, screen mode, right, to just get out of there and get the W. So is this a lingering concern? Should it be about Milton? To what extent? And how serious should we engage with the idea of Nico, some point down the line? It's not going to happen this week, but if Milton's struggles from the first half Saturday persist, how serious do we have to take the Nico idea?
Yeah, I mean, it could come into play later in the season. I don't think it will, but I think the door is open to that possibility. I said at the beginning of the season it would probably take a couple of SEC losses for Josh Heupel to consider a change. So let's say Tennessee loses to Florida, and then beats UTSA with Joe Milton, and then loses to South Carolina. Okay, then we're talking about a season that's not going to go 10 wins or whatever, like a Tennessee fan would hope it would be. And then you're into sort of resetting the quarterback position, and you're looking to the future maybe, or at least you're giving Nico a chance. Because if you're not going to win SEC games, what's the point of being out there? That's the goal. But it's going to take, I think, a couple of losses like that for them to make the change. The thing with Nico, and again, I get a lot of these emails. There's the Milton defenders, stick with him no matter what, and then there's the there's the hey, I've seen this Joe before. Let's drop him and let's move on to Nico. The latter bunch, I understand the frustration because what Joe did bad, especially early in the game, is what he's done before. He gets juiced up, he overthrows. And you can't afford to do that when a guy is schemed open, you have to hit him, and they're gonna pay for that if Joe Milton can't do that, and then those guys have to catch the ball too, so it goes both ways. I think the thing that maybe frustrates me the most when fans call for Nico, and they've done this in 2 games, by the way. You've heard the chants Nico, Nico. Heard it at the Virginia game, and they were in Neyland again this time. I want to know, and I've asked fans this, what are you using to support the fact that Nico absolutely is a better option than Joe Milton right now.
That 5-star rating.
That's right.
The recruiting service ranking.
It's 5-star rating. It's a, I watched his YouTube clips from high school. That pass was awesome that he threw to Ethan Davis in the spring game. He was 2 for 3 against Virginia. And I'm not dogging Nico. I think he's a tremendous talent. I think he's probably going to be really, really good. But I don't understand what you're judging it off of. If you're judging Nico off of whatever you've seen from clips or that he has a 5-star rating, then you have to say Joe Milton is awesome and going to win the Heisman because he threw a ball 85 yards at the Manning camp. These are the same things. You're taking a little snippet of the best thing that he did at a thing that's not an SEC game, and then putting that into an SEC game. There's so much more to playing quarterback than completing the ball from A to B. That's a big part of it. But Joe Milton is better in the other areas than Nico is right now. It's making decisions in their RPO game and the run pass options. Joe Milton is much better than Nico now, which he should be. He's been around a lot longer. Nico's just learning the offense and changing the pass protections. Joe Milton is much better than Nico is. And just running the offense, running the 4-minute offense. And a lot of this comes from coaches that talked about this in fall camp, that Nico is learning those sort of things. Just managing the offense, running the ball. Joe Milton is a more effective runner right now than Nico. There's just so many things in the decision-making part of the job that Joe Milton has close to a master's degree in, where Nico is in the 101 class. And I think, Nico could play and maybe close that gap. But I'm not saying Nico is not going to be a great quarterback. I'm just saying, give it time. You're 2-0. Joe Milton's been on campus for 3 years. He has yet to throw an interception. Let's give it time. I guess is my summary. Give it time.
Yeah, you're asking fans to be patient, and that's not in the fan handbook. There's no chapter that says be patient. It doesn't exist, and that's universal, not just with Tennessee. Think about Georgia over the last few years. Had all these. It had 2 5-star quarterbacks, some 4-stars. And then it had a no-star quarterback, Stetson Bennett, who just kept beating them all out. And I bet there was still fans, even as Georgia was winning the national championship, that thought that a 5-star should be starting over Stetson Bennett. People embrace these recruiting services with such fervor. They place so much import on it. And we know that's just not the ultimate determining factor on how good somebody is. I think Nico will be really good too. I think, however, I wonder, like watching Joe Milton Saturday, it reminded me of the Joe Milton of 2021 against Bowling Green and Pittsburgh before he was injured in the first 2 games of the season. He was just missing open receivers. Not so much on deep balls, but on those intermediate throws. I wonder if he gets a little anxious or hyped up, as Adam said, maybe a little more anxious when he's throwing over the middle, because there is a greater risk with those passes. You're having to read more of the field. You're not as sure where everybody is, as opposed to one of those bubble screens to the outside. You know what you're dealing with there. It's a small body of defenders. And so I wonder if that could be contributed to it and could be a factor in it. And I remember Joe Milton talking about how he's too hard on himself. And they said, well, this year, that's something he's worked on. But maybe he was too hard on himself after that slow start against Austin Peay. He can't get away with that against SEC opponents, except Vanderbilt maybe. But I just think I don't think Tennessee has a lot of choice here. I mean, it's pretty much got to hope Joe Milton plays the way they think he can play at a high level, and then develop Nico along the way. Now, after the open date week in October, if Nico's made huge strides and Milton is struggling, then that might be an issue. But I just don't see how you could do that now.
Yeah, I just think any fan that wants the switch from Milton to Nico, you have to gauge the pluses and minuses. If Nico is a better passer in an SEC game, let's make that assumption. I don't think that's necessarily true, but let's make that assumption. Okay, you add that, and then you subtract all the things that I said before. So now Jalen Wright rushing for 100 yards the last two games may not happen because Nico doesn't know what run to check into. Your issues, some with protection in the middle of the line at left guard and center, that's been happening. That may be worse because Nico didn't necessarily change the pass protections as well as Joe does. You're not efficient in the 4-minute offense, so a couple of the faster drives, scoring drives that they've had, don't run as well as they have with Joe Milton. The RPO game, which some of that was what worked the other day. They had some bubble screens, but they had some RPO stuff where it was short passes that Brew McCoy would catch and run over somebody and go 8 yards. Nico is not necessarily gonna bat 1,000 in making those decisions. So you're subtracting those things, when you go to Nico, and maybe you're adding others. Again, that may be the right decision at some point. But I don't really see a reason to rush into that just yet.
Blake,
I guess I would go devil's advocate, guys, because I understand the skepticism, honestly. I think Joe Milton's lost his starting job twice before, and I don't default into like the coach knows best mode because coach did know best in 2021. Josh Heupel had it wrong. He thought Joe Milton was the right starting quarterback for Tennessee that season, and he wasn't. Hendon Hooker was, and Joe Milton, exited that week 2 game with an injury of some sort against Pittsburgh. Hooker took the reins and he was off and running. And I know the coaching staff will say now, like, yeah, well, Hooker, got better as he went. He did. And it's sometimes hard to gauge in practice when you can't hit quarterbacks, how they're going to play live. That's true. But, I'm not advocating for a quarterback change by any means, but I do think that if Milton's struggles move beyond Austin Peay, I think this idea is going to gain some legitimacy because even though we haven't seen a ton of Nico, it's not like the reports have been bad about him. Everything you hear is that he had a good preseason. Spring game's not worth much, but he did play well in the spring game, and we've seen Milton stumble in the past, and it's hard to get that out of people's minds. And we know coaching staffs have fell in love with his big arm before, but it hasn't always held up in game action. So best case scenario for Tennessee, in my opinion, is Milton comes out this week in the Swamp, puts this whole thing to bed, and said, yeah, that had one bad half against Austin Peay. Forget about it. I'm good to go, guys. And cruises from there. But if the struggles persist, I don't know. I'd be ready to kind of engage with the idea of seeing a little more Nico.
Yeah, and I almost feel that maybe some of the urgency of the frustrated Vol fans coming through as I talk about these scenarios, because like I laid it out earlier of, okay, if they go down and he plays poorly against Florida and they lose, and then maybe he plays poorly against South Carolina and they lose, well, now you can pull the trigger and you can go to Nico. Where I think some Tennessee fans that are in the turn the ball over to Nico camp are saying, no, make the change before the losses. Don't give up games that you could have won otherwise. And maybe that's more of what you're Blake, with your comparison to the 2021 was, because if they wait a couple of games there, you don't get the Hendon Hooker maybe for almost a full season like you would have otherwise. But two different scenarios. One of them was a seasoned guy that had played a while. What made Hendon Hooker the better choice going from Milton to Hooker was that Hooker was a very, very good decision maker, most efficient quarterback in UT history, really throwing the ball and in the country when he was playing, and just sort of could create things. had great instincts. Those are none of the things that you expect a freshman to have. Those are things that talented quarterbacks are expected to have, but to expect Nico to come in as a true freshman and have those things that not necessarily it wouldn't necessarily take time, but it probably would take time if he's like, even almost all the 5-star quarterbacks out there. But I can feel Tennessee fans saying, if you're going to make the change, make it. Who am I to give away games? But I do think there's I think there's a better chance that Joe Milton plays pretty well and Tennessee has a pretty good season than there is Nico come in this early in the year and somehow lead them to a better season.
These quarterback changes are so tricky. I go back through the years. I remember in 1994, Jerry Coke, who was Tennessee's starting quarterback, got hurt in about the 7th play of the UCLA game. His career is done. He was a good quarterback. He just hadn't started before. If he hadn't been injured, he would have been the quarterback throughout 94, and Peyton Manning would have never become the starter. But once he went out, you had Todd Helton ahead of Manning, and you had Brandon Stewart, another freshman, kind of considered to be on the same level as Manning. But by midseason, Peyton Manning was a quarterback. And Tennessee, I think his first start was against Washington State in Neyland Stadium. And Tennessee pulled out a close win. I think it was something like 10-7. But Peyton Manning was not the Peyton Manning. They became one of the greatest quarterbacks in football history. He couldn't. Tennessee won with defense that day. So it's hard to think of a freshman just coming in and being what he might become. So there is obviously risk in this. But I go back with other quarterback changes. Tennessee started Casey Clausen as a freshman, true freshman. It started Eric Ainge as a true freshman and did well. But they didn't have another quarterback with experience who was as good as Joe Milton is. So, it's just it's just a hard choice to make, particularly on a small body of evidence. No, you don't want just throw away a game, but I think it would be too much to ask of Nico to make his first college start against Florida in the Swamp, albeit a not very good Florida team. That's just not the way to break in a freshman quarterback.
You can't start him in the Swamp. That's kind of crazy talk.
Well, and the interesting thing is, Joe, for better or worse, suffers from his past that we've seen, overthrow Joe, right? In the past. So, he completed like 2/3 of his passes the other day. Now, most of them were bubble screens and they were short, and we understand that. He was not throwing the ball downfield. But he started 1 of 8, and if I remember, 3 of them were on him. 3 of them were overthrows. And then he completed 11 straight. Again, short passes. But we're judging him on 3 bad throws, and we have reason to, because we've seen those type of throws before. They were overthrows. They were on him. So had we not had that evidence in the past, we would just say, what's everybody freaking out over 3 bad throws in the first quarter? But if you take it beyond that, and let's just say Joe Milton is the starting quarterback for a while, as we thought he would be up until a few days ago, and I still think he's got to have some help on the receiver set. So he started 1 of 8, he overthrew 3, and then there were like 4 drops after that of passes that were on target. I think something that Joe Milton, he was not getting any help from his wide receivers. And I think that's something that's hurt in this transition. As much going from Hooker to Milton, the receivers, he needs a guy to go to. If you think back at Hendon Hooker, he always knew he could throw the ball to Cedric Tillman. If you even look at the Pitt game last season, he targeted Cedric Tillman like 22 times or something. He just, anytime he could, he threw it to Cedric Tillman and he would get it. Joe Milton does not have that guy right now. You would hope it would be Brew McCoy, and he did have some catches the other day, but most of them, again, were little short hitches and bubble screens. he's got to have Brew McCoy be that guy that he can trust to. If I'm throwing it, he's catching it. Last year, Hendon Hooker had Jalen Hyatt, where when Josh Heupel or the OC Alex Golish would set up a play to where Jalen Hyatt was open over the middle, he was going to make the defense pay. Squirrel White is not that guy right now for Joe Milton. 2 games in, I understand that. And then Ramel Keaton, who had a really good season last year, he caught a touchdown pass this last game. He also had a drop or 2, and he fumbled the ball. The Oregon transfer, Dante Thornton, I think is probably going to be a pretty good player, but he had at least 1 drop, maybe 2 drops the other day. I think he had a drop against Virginia. So I guess what I'm saying is Hendon Hooker did have pieces in place that would help him even in his not great games. And Joe Milton, while he overthrew some balls early on, he's got to have some help from those guys as well.
How much? Let's dive into the Florida deal, guys. We know Florida this is not one of their most dynamic teams. They were terrible in Week 1 against Utah. Graham Mertz, not one of the more exciting quarterbacks in the conference, I suppose. The Wisconsin transfer, certainly not up to the standard of some past Florida quarterbacks, although Mertz has been better for Florida so far than he was for much of his Wisconsin run. We see the betting line at this game around 7 points. How much do you think is that built on Florida's history in the Swamp? They haven't lost in that building to Tennessee since 2003. Would Tennessee, do you think, be bigger favorites in this game, if not for that history? And how much do you guys have the history in mind, as you think about what might be possible in this game? Because I think all these struggles we're talking about with Austin Peay aside, if we were to throw history out the window, I think we'd probably, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we'd probably predict a Tennessee win with some level of confidence here. But it does feel like all those past nightmares in the Swamp in years gone by is kind of giving some pause in this game.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few factors. If Tennessee against Austin Peay did what we thought they would do, which is, win by 40 or 50 points or whatever and put up a ton of points, then I think the line would probably be more like 10 because people would say, okay, well, this is the Tennessee offense of last year, or at least, some version of it. So we haven't seen that in that way yet. So I think that's cause for a little bit of doubt. The history is a little bit of cause for doubt. And I've said on here a few times just this season that the Swamp, Ben Hill Griffin Stadium is one of those venues where whatever you think the line should be in your mind, it changes about 3 points once you get in there. It's just a place where good teams cannot be as good, and mediocre Florida teams can rise to the occasion. Tennessee has to start well in this game. If they're up against the crowd and they struggle early on and that passing game is not there and Tennessee's having to rely on the run game and it's not really getting things downfield, so now they're having to do the short passing game and there's just no momentum, and then your confidence lowers, then they could be in trouble, because that's a tough place to play if you don't have much working for you. They've got to start well, and that's what they did the last 2 years. Tennessee is has been the highest scoring first quarter team in college football the last 2 years. It's 12 points, a little over that a game. I think last year was 10 points a game in the first quarter. 2 years ago, it was over 14 points a game in the first quarter. They've always gotten, at least under Josh Heupel, they've got on people early and they've pressed the issue regardless of who the opponent is. They did that against Georgia. They did that against Alabama. They always do that. And this year they've scored, 14 points? 10 points. They've scored 10 points in the first quarter against 2 bad teams. That's not going to get it. They have to come out and put some points on the board early on. And if you do that, then suddenly Florida's on their heels. So I think so much of this, how this game goes, is probably going to be dictated by how the first quarter goes.
To Adam's point about the Swamp and the the factor it can be in a game. I go back to the 1995 game. Tennessee with Peyton Manning was up 30-14. Florida scored 48 straight points. I'd never seen anything like that in a game of top 10 teams. And it was, though, the momentum, it was just accelerated by the crowd. It's like they were going hand in hand. The team, the crowd. It was almost like watching a basketball team. Then in 2007, the same thing happened at Tennessee. It was 28-20. Arian Foster fumbled. Florida picked it up and scored. And the next thing you knew, Florida had 59 points. It was 59-20. So the momentum it seems like when Florida gets rolling in the Swamp, and those games have been a while back, but in the past, when that happened, they just kept rolling. But I think one thing worth noting about this in the Swamp, the last time Tennessee had a coaching advantage over Florida was in 2003. Coincidentally, that's the last time it won against Florida in the Swamp. It was Phillip Fulmer against Ron Zook. Ron Zook, they couldn't get rid of him fast enough, followed Steve Spurrier. This is the first time since then, to me, that Tennessee has a decided coaching advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. And going back to last year, even outside of the Swamp, the question was, could Tennessee erase some of the demons against Florida, regardless of venue? And Josh Heupel was able to get that done. Winning in Gainesville, of course, is a little bit of a challenge of a different sort.
Yeah, if this comes down to X's and O's, Tennessee wins. If this comes down to Jimmy's and Joe's, so to speak, I like Tennessee's chances pretty well too. If this comes down to intangibles and environment and momentum and all that, that's of those three types of games. That last one is the type that Tennessee could be in trouble. Because of the venue, and it's such a weird dynamic. If I remember right, this is the first time since 1971 that Tennessee has been ranked and Florida has not. Tennessee, within the program, because of what happened last season and because of this trajectory they've been on under Josh Heupel, there are thoughts of this could be another 9, 10, 11-win season. In the preseason, you heard the team say, we want to win the East. We want to win the SEC East. Got to get to Atlanta. And so there's this goal out there that is a legitimate goal for what they have and what they are coming off from doing last year and winning the Orange Bowl and all that. I don't know what Florida's rallying cry is. I don't think it's to win the East. This is a team that has already lost a game. Now, granted, it was against a very good Utah team. If Tennessee had played Utah, I'm not so sure they would be undefeated right now. So Florida knows they're playing for probably a mid-tier bowl this year. 6, 7, I don't know, maybe 8 wins, whatever. But they're not going to win the East. And so now they're now an underdog at their home stadium, and they are almost they're a September spoiler as much as anything. Tennessee, you think you're a team now, you think you're back. Well, you can't win in the Swamp. That's the spoiler role that Florida has now, where Tennessee now is more of we're a top 10 team. We're coming there to get off on the right foot in SEC play, because you got to run the table in the SEC and get to the Alabama game and get to the Georgia game and all these lofty goals. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic. Again, if Tennessee starts well, this goes into their favor, because it looks like what these two teams should look like at this point, which Tennessee is the better team and they're going to win the game, whether it's home, road, whatever. If Tennessee struggles early on, then all the momentum goes to Florida, and then I think Tennessee could get tight. So it really comes down to a lot of how this one starts. Tennessee potentially could have a confidence problem. I'm not saying they do have one, but they could potentially have one if early on in this game they look like what they did last week.
I've got a rallying cry for Florida.
Oh,
Save our coach. Because
More
if
likely
Flo-
in Florida, John, it's fire our coach. I mean, they had fireronzook.com. Wasn't that registered within about a month of him having the job?
Well, I think
Will Will
Napier at
Muschamp.
Save Our Coaches, isn't it? Because isn't his staff like 400 people or something? It's like half of Gainesville is employed on that staff.
Yeah, so will have a huge negative impact on the economy of Gainesville if Billy Napier's let go. But if he starts out his Gator tenure at 7-9 with a couple of embarrassing losses, Vanderbilt, by the way, along the course of that, then yeah, he's got to catch a lot of heat. So that should be Florida's rallying cry.
Last thing before we go, guys, John and I talked about this a little bit over on our SEC Football Unfiltered podcast, but wanted to get your guys' opinion on the rivalry in general here. We know the SEC is going to 16 teams next year. Divisions are going away. Tennessee will still play Florida next season. That's been announced for the schedule. We don't know how much longer this series, though, will remain an annual game. I think we all kind of tend to think, based on what we've heard and pieced together, that this probably at some point will go to be played once every 2 years rather than remaining an annual rivalry. Of course, this rivalry doesn't stretch back to the lengths of the Alabama-Tennessee rivalry. For Florida, it's not the Georgia-Florida game, but at one time in the 90s, it was one of the biggest annual games in college football. So a 1 through 10 scale, guys, I'll go first, and I want you guys to weigh in as well. 1 through 10, with 1 being not at all and 10 being a whole heck of a lot. How much will you miss this game being on the annual slate if in 2025 or at some point in the future it does go down to being once every 2 years? 1, you don't care at all that is changing. 10, you'll miss it quite a bit. I'll lead us off. I'll say 7. Because, I was born in the 80s, so growing up a college football fan in the 90s, really liked this game. And we saw what it was in its heyday, which was pretty awesome series. Didn't have the longevity of some other rivalries, but there's some heat there. 2 really good venues in terms of stadiums. And, I thought at its best, this was a good series. Hasn't been at its best for many, many years, doesn't have the history, so that's what maybe keeps me from going higher than a 7. But I like this game. It's, it's one of my favorite games usually in the season to cover, even when the teams aren't great. I kind of look forward to this game. So I'll go 7 on my how much will I miss it meter.
I'll go 8. I grew up watching Tennessee football my whole life, but primarily the 90s. And that's when this thing was going. And for a certain generation and a certain age fan, this is still going almost as well as it was back then. It may not seem that way, and I understand that. Certainly the younger generation would not understand that. But, if, this week I'll probably end up eating fried gator po' boys in Knoxville. My wife gets them every year, and they have them at the high school where she teaches. I know I grew up. You would do things like that. There's a segment of Tennessee fans that they still recognize this as Gator Hate Week. It's just so tied into the culture of that generation of fans. So I'll miss that. Really, I think I'll probably miss that because of who replaces that game. I think you can. The Florida rivalry with Tennessee is almost like alternate uniforms. If you're a certain age, you say, I don't like these new things. But then there's a certain younger age that this is what's your problem? I don't understand. These are fun. So I think there's a generational gap in there between those things. But when Florida goes off the schedule and then suddenly you get into a season and Tennessee's playing Mississippi State instead of Florida, or they're playing Texas A&M, South Carolina, it's just it's not so much what you lose, but what replaces it will make that hole a little bigger, I think. So I completely understand how a younger generation would say this is like a 2. But to me, it's an 8 because my entire life, Florida, Tennessee has meant something, even when both teams were down.
If this were Florida and Tennessee of the 1990s, I would say a 10. I would be devastated if you couldn't have the Tennessee Florida game. It was the game on the schedule. It was bigger than Alabama because both teams were in the same division, and you almost had to win that game to win the East. It didn't always play out that way, but it was such a big deal. But neither program is the same. Florida coming off a losing season. I'm looking forward to Texas and Oklahoma in this league. And I can remember other rivalries. I've seen rivalries come and go. I can remember when Tennessee and Auburn had a lot of great games against each other, and that was a really good rivalry. So I'd probably go about a 5 now.
Have you ever had a Gator po' boy?
Yes,
Gator?
I have. Yeah, I have.
Yeah, they're good. Now, I as an objective journalist, don't care anything about the symbolism of eating gator on Florida week, but I'll of course always partake because I love anything fried. So
well, gator meat can be kind of chewy. I've had some bad alligator, but I've also had some good gator dishes down in outside Florida, outside Gainesville. In fact, there was a really good restaurant I used to go to.
As they say, it tastes like chicken, but chicken's really good, so that's a compliment.
All right. Well, we know what's on the menu in the Sparks household this week. It's fried gator. We'll see if gator is on Tennessee's menu on Saturday night at the Swamp. Adam will have the coverage all week over at knoxnews.com. John and I will have the commentary, and we'll be back here to discuss next week. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.